introduce myself, and while he's getting his technology all squared away.
Figure this out.
First, thanks for the invitation. My name's Duane Freese. I'm the executive director of the IRL Council that was created back in 2015 to restructure the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program. You know, we started as a program all the way back in '89 and '90. And I was actually part of that, so it was crazy. I graduated from college with my PhD, and one of the first things I did was to assist in getting the Indian River Lagoon nominated with then Governor Martinez as a national estuary program. So kind of crazy that you would go, 25 years, and then towards the end of your career, get the opportunity to basically become the executive director of the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program, hosted by this new special district of the state of Florida, with the mission to, see if we can do it better. And you don't see that in government very often, where, government, sees where you are, sees where you should be, and then restructures. And so my job over the last 6 years has been, shepherding that restructuring. And, we are now right at that mature national estuary program. We know where we're going. We know what needs to be done. We have a comprehensive conservation management plan in place, and now it's all about the investment, getting investments. So what I thought I'd do today, we do this casually, because I've got some questions for you all, especially some of you have been shrimping for a couple decades. But tell you what's going on in the lagoon, the whole lagoon right now, like in the last few days, in the last few weeks. Give you an idea of where the work's going, because we often hear, nobody's doing anything, you're never going to get out in front of this. And I am encouraged by where we are at a level that I could not have said any time in the last 43 years I've been here. We haven't turned the corner by any stretch of the imagination, but we are pointed in the right direction. And then we'll have a conversation. You can ask me questions, and I got a few questions for you all who know this system up here really well. So I'm going to start north and move my way south. So northern Mosquito Lagoon, it's been holding its own. I mean, we have water clarity issues when we get winds like this, but northern Mosquito Lagoon, because it's close to Ponce Inlet, water clarity has been relatively good. Seagrasses, for the most part, have diminished lagoon-wide, but there are places where we see pretty healthy patches of seagrasses, especially starting now. You'll see the seagrasses coming back, but we are diminished at levels that we would never have imagined back in the 2005, 2006. So 2007 was a high point, for seagrasses in the lagoon. We had grass that was equivalent to like the 1940s. And then it's kind of started to taper. In 2010 and 11, we had the super bloom. And since 2011, we believe as scientists that we've hit a tipping point, because we've had blooms every single year since 2011, and of species that we have not seen before. So super bloom was one of these cyanobacteria, then it was brown tide, and then we see the normal ones that you all hear about. So, when everybody goes out at night to look at bioluminescence, that is an organism. It's in the same family as red tide. It's called pyrodinium, that has that bioluminescence. But that can be toxic when it gets to really high levels. And we've had, occasional blooms of that, but you go back 50, 100 years, and the best we know is the system has always had blooms, but not like we have today. And so the blooms were short, seasonal, usually wet season with the rains, not long duration, not doing a lot of damage. And it was 2 or 3 different, species that were the bad players. And now we're seeing it, literally we're about to start seeing blooms again. If this year is anything like the last 9, as soon as it starts raining, you will see it start getting patchy, even up here. And then as you get to southern Mosquito Lagoon, it starts filling in where it's fairly extensive. and it will be really extensive all the way down to Melbourne Causeway, 192 in Melbourne. And then it starts to get patchy again, and then of course Southern Lagoon I'll mention in a minute. And so what's driving this is a combination of things. Algal blooms, are a natural feature. If you don't have algae, you don't have the little plankton that eat algae, and then the little fish that eat those plankton, and the shrimp, and the crabs, and so it moves up the food chain. They only become harmful when they are like what we've had. Large areas, long duration, super turbid water. Brown tide was particularly damaging to seagrasses. It's because of the kind of cell it is, you get that brown color. No light gets to the bottom. And so, without exaggerating, we are still in a catastrophic position with seagrasses. And it's not just one species. We have 7 species. We are not seeing seagrass regrowth almost anywhere in the lagoon, including places you would expect we'd be back to normal now. So Sebastian Inlet, you may have heard some news. They just saw 6 acres coming back. That 6 acres is nothing like we saw back in, the early 2000s. So yes, it's trying to recover. But remember, even at the inlets, you got incoming tide, clear ocean water, outgoing tide, dirty lagoon water, and so seagrasses are struggling everywhere. From here all the way down to Jupiter Inlet. And there's some things we just don't understand about where we have really decent clarity. So around Indian River County, north and south of Sebastian Inlet, we're not seeing seagrass regrowth down there either in any degree that we would have expected. So there's more happening. So what drives a harmful algal bloom? We kind of have a good idea about that now because it's happening all over the United States. It's nutrients are number one. So you fertilize the lawn, it turns really green. You put too much fertilizer in this system, and you're going to have organisms respond to that available nutrient. And that is the big driver. It's not just nitrogen, it's nitrogen and phosphorus. But you notice, the nutrients haven't changed much right now, but it's pretty clear. We have cooler water, and we haven't had this push of fresh water, groundwater and surface water during the rainy season. So salinity is a big player in this, but the really big one also is temperature. So warmer temperatures, salinity shifts, nutrients, all that comes together, and it's like a weed in a golf course. If you've ever, how many people golf? I mean, I don't golf, but I've been around golf courses, and I've worked for a landscape architect. You see one weed and you got to get on it because the next week it'll be 10. And if you don't get on it, after a month, your grass is gone, the weeds are in. That's what we have here. We have certain players in that water column, these planktonic algae, and some of them are cyanobacteria that are like algae. They're just waiting for conditions to get right, and then they start to bloom, and if conditions don't change, then you've got a bloom that's going to last a week, 2 weeks. In our case, the brown tide back in 15-16 started literally it started green in December, shifted to brown right around mid-January. And you saw it all the way up, almost up here, and it'd get patchier as you go north. And it sustained itself almost until April, May. And then it slowly started to back down.
What can you do, though, about these, like around here, Brevard County, you only have to worry about the sewage running into the water. But you get down, I got a buddy who lives on a river in Jensen Beach, and like every year, I guess, they drain the water out of Lake Okeechobee. That comes into the Indian River Lagoon system and just turns everything brown, nasty brown. Further south, you got the sugar cane people.
It's a great question, and the answer is everybody's contributing to that nutrient load. Everybody. So whether you put fertilizer on your grass, right along one of these beachside
then it rains
homes, and not only when it rains, but even during the dry season, when you can legally fertilize. Well, most people will fertilize what do? They turn on their sprinklers and run it for like 12 hours. So it might as well be the rainy season because a lot of that fertilizer is running down. So every citizen has got an opportunity to cut fertilizer, pesticides, and herbicides. Down south is a particularly difficult problem. And I like to put them in two buckets. So you got the chronic problems, which we all have, 6 counties along the lagoons, because the tip of the northern part of Palm Beach County, just by Jupiter Inlet, they've got a piece of that. And the chronic issues are wastewater treatment plants that are not up to what they should be doing in the 21st century. They're old, they're not maintained well. You have problems like we just did down in the city of Titusville the day before Christmas Eve.
Yep.
And I'm going to be honest, there's no excuse to be having line breaks at the rate we do in the state of Florida. It's not occasional, it's like all the time. And not all, utilities are the same. Some of them are older than others, but that's a big fix. If you want a new wastewater treatment plant, you're talking, 50 to 100 to 150 million dollars. But we're growing at about 1,500 people a day in the state of Florida. And if we don't have the wastewater treatment systems to handle that new growth, then it just gets worse. And a lot of it isn't handling the people we have now. So every county, and every city, and even the private utilities are going to have to do a better job and start setting a higher standard, not just the legal standard, but do everything they can to prevent these breaks. But then you've got 300,000 septic systems. And we know septic systems, especially traditional septic, will contribute nitrogen and phosphorus to the groundwater. There's more than enough data to show that. It just varies from house to house, and it depends on the soil. So the wetter the soil, so the closer you are to the river, the older the septic system, and if the water table is close to that drain field, in a lot of cases, those drain fields aren't working at all. And during the fall, when we have our king tides, even if you have 6 inches of separation, and you've seen the king tides, last fall was one of the biggest I've ever seen. We have thousands of septic systems that are basically coming out of the tank straight to groundwater, which goes straight to the lowest. It's either going to the lakes, or first magnitude springs, or it's going to the lagoon. So I like to say we have a plumbing problem. But the other big part of that plumbing is stormwater. And I'm going to get to Lake Okeechobee because that's not a chronic problem. That's an extreme event issue. But we have stormwater problems that are, our tributaries which go west. So the Little Flounder Creeks, the Crane Creek, Sebastian River, all that land, is draining into the tributary, running into the system. So if we went back before humans came into Florida, even here, you can see how disturbed this is right here. We've got Brazilian peppers. But if we were here 100 years ago, we'd be looking at marsh. Back then it was probably, salt marsh. Probably not that many mangroves back then up this far north, but it would have slowly graded, up into higher, palm, hammocks, and then oak hammocks, and then back down into these swales. So this rain that happens filtered down into the groundwater, slow release, filtered through wetlands. We've lost about 50% of the wetland filtration, which are the kidneys for the lagoon. And now every time it rains, even here, we get rainfall, of course not under here, but right here, that's running down, running to the lagoon. And if there's fertilizer or, soils or erosion, it's all heading to the system. So when you start adding this up over 70, 80 years, what we've got are sources that need to be stopped or reduced. And then we've got areas of muck in the lagoon. And a lot of people look at muck and muck dredging, and they're thinking about clamshells. When you dredge muck, it's vacuuming. And there's really good data now for Sebastian River, especially the O'Galley dredge project, that it really does make an improvement. So the people in O'Galley, you said you live there, we were getting phone calls 2 months after that dredge project stopped from people who lived along there who were saying, it's unbelievable. We've got barnacles back on our, on our pilings on our docks. The bulkheads were starting to show, little signs of, all sorts of critters that they hadn't had before. But muck, it's interesting. It's about 70% fine sand, silt, and clay, which is inorganic. That's not contributing to the problem. And people think, if I've got 2 meters of muck, that's bad. If I got 2 inches of muck, that's better. Muck, because it's so fine, and you've got that 30% organic, actually creates, it's like its own nutrient creator. The bacteria are fluxing nutrients all the time with the water column. And so it's not like you're sucking out just the nutrients in the system when you do that, but you're stopping that little engine of nutrient cycling, and you're doing much more. So most muck, and I know all of you, if you've been in the lagoon, have stepped in muck and you start to sink in, what do you smell? Yeah, it's rotten eggs, hydrogen sulfide. Seagrass can't grow in muck. Hydrogen sulfide is super low pH, so organisms won't live in it. It's toxic to most organisms other than bacteria. And so when you dredge muck, you got to dredge it all the way. You got to get it right. So if you get it wrong, you're wasting money. There's no question. You have to have people who know what they're doing. If you leave 2 inches of muck and it was 3 feet, you haven't made any improvements, because it's not about how deep it is. It's about the surface area, because it's fluxing. And so there's expertise starting to happen. Every muck project, you learn a little bit along the way. And so let's look at down south. So you all hear about Lake Okeechobee. I was just down there this past week. The cyanobacteria bloom, which is a freshwater bloom, has an organism called microcystis, and it has a toxin called microcystin. It is dangerous to humans, dangerous to wildlife, dangerous to dogs and cats. In fact, when we had a bad bloom a few years ago, a number of people lost their dogs because they just didn't know. And so if you're ever out with your dog and you see a stormwater pond, or a little swale, and it's got shimmery, almost fluorescent green color on it, don't let your dog drink. It may be a different species and they're not always toxic, but just don't take the chance, because it goes straight to kidneys and liver, and it's really, really dangerous. And especially, water dogs, first thing they want to do is go swim, and when they're swimming, they're drinking. But be really careful in fresh water, if you see an algal bloom. And that's true. People go, is it safe to go in the water? You got to make your call. No government agency is going to be able to say, okay, it's safe here and not safe there. We're not at that point yet. You got an algal bloom and you have dead fish, go a mile or two south. You could be out of it, and the water is perfectly clear. It's that patchy at times. So Lake Okeechobee now, the bloom is 500 square miles. Almost half the lake is now in a very serious algal bloom. There's not much you can do, although in certain cities like Pahokee had a mass of that bloom come into their boat area, the marina, and they actually intervened and vacuumed it out. But what happens there, and it's an interesting story of Florida that who would have known back in the 40s and the 50s and earlier than that all the growth we see in Orlando and here too would actually impact Lake Okeechobee so far. But from Shingle Creek, just south of Orlando, all the way down the Kissimmee chain, all of that fresh water comes down the spine of Florida and ultimately starts to feed into Lake Okeechobee. And the lake levels right now are higher than we would like. And the Corps of Engineers operates that lake at certain safety levels so the dike doesn't become compromised, putting human safety at risk. Because if that dike goes, You know, we're going to have lots of people and communities completely flooded. And so we're really concerned as we're coming into the wet season that we'll see a discharge from Lake Okeechobee. It doesn't happen every year, but you know, how you manage that lake, which is super complicated, and at what level you keep it in the dry season, it is a real challenge. The agricultural communities need that water, you know, to water their crops. The urban core needs that water for potable water for drinking, you know, and then it's what level, you know, do you protect the lake at? The good news down there was they had the best birding nesting season possibly in the last 100 years. And I saw some pictures and it was like, it gives me goosebumps just telling you. You know, they saw bird roosting areas that were 4 or 5 times what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 decades because the water levels were right, you know, and they were able to get out on those islands. So we have a system that is not dead. So if you hear people going, it's dead, it's never going to come back, it's hopeless, that is absolutely not true. And I can give you 3 or 4 examples that we in the National Estuary Program use as examples, and one of them is right here in Florida. Tampa Bay, you know, 35 years ago, you know, was green as pea soup with almost no seagrasses. Fishing was totally compromised. When I got here in '78, I saw that. It was like, it was coming from Rhode Island, and I thought, what am I looking at? It looked like algae everywhere. Today, Tampa Bay is, you know, in really good shape. This problem they're having with this Piney Point is not helping, and there are some areas that still need work up in Old Tampa Bay, mainly because there's not a lot of water flow. And that's the story we have here from southern Mosquito, Banana River, northern Indian River Lagoon, down to about Melbourne. Flow has been constricted by all these causeways. And the other big flow constrictor, if you go on Google Maps, look at the crawlerway of Kennedy Space Center and the launch facilities. When that was built, of course, nobody knew back then, you know, nor did they think about this stuff. But the Mosquito Lagoon was totally separated on its southern end from the northern Banana, and there was a creek that ran through, Banana Creek, that connected that system to the east to the northern Indian River Lagoon, and that has been totally compromised with construction. And so you don't see those flows. Some of you may remember Charlie Sembler, you know, his family, you know, generational commercial fishers, you know, down in Sebastian. And Charlie told me a story about him and his dad, you know, pre-NASA when he was a little kid with his grandfather, that he'd hear his grandfather would tell him the sheet flow coming out of Mosquito Lagoon to the south on a northeast wind, you know, was, you could feel it on your legs. You know, oysters were 200, 300, 400 yards to get from, you know, where you put your boat, you know, on anchor. You'd have to walk across these massive oyster beds to get to some of these, you know, little hunting cottages. And there are stories that have been published just out of Titusville, you know, coming into Banana Creek. One I remember in particular where somebody was rowing back to Titusville to get supplies, had the shotgun, saw so many ducks that they didn't know what direction to point, you know, with a double barrel shotgun because there were thousands of ducks, 360 degrees, you know, and of course when he discharged that gun it had gotten wet, neither barrel went off. But you know, that's what we had. We're never getting back to that. I mean, that's the reality of this. You can't turn the clock back on these systems, but you can turn that clock forward. So if you look at Tampa Bay and their progress, you look at Chesapeake Bay and that progress, you look at sections in Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island, this is all about fixing the infrastructure you have that isn't working, mainly it's nutrient reduction, and doing the right thing. And then also making sure that the new development is regulated at a level that's different than what we did before. where you're paying attention to wastewater, stormwater, how you do vegetation, going natural instead of, the kinds of vegetation that requires a lot of chemicals. We could see this turn around and start. It's already starting a little bit, but we're not going to see the impact of what we're doing for a decade, but we'll see it in 2. So it isn't going to take a generation, but it is going to take a lot of money. So I brought a number of these, and Frank, if there's extras, or some of you may be guiding if you want to, take a few more. And I'm not going to go into the detail, but every year we put out an annual report with the National Estuary Program, because we think U.S. citizens need to know where the money's going. So we show you every single project we did, and who brought the money, and what was done. Those projects in each of the cities and counties are starting to get good. When we first started, we'd say, we want a nutrient. How much nutrients are you reducing? How much pollutants? A lot of times you just don't have the technical staff to do that. And now we're actually demanding it. If you put a proposal, you get funded through us, we want to see exactly what you're reducing or what you're removing or what you're rebuilding. But we were hearing so often in the community, even within my own management conference, which is 100 volunteers in 3 different committees, gosh, nobody's doing anything. We decided, well, we'll showcase everybody's projects that we can. And so we put the word out to all the counties, all the cities, Riverside Conservancy, and said, if you're doing a really good project in 2020, tell us what that project is. And we had like 260 projects happening throughout the lagoon last year. We could only showcase about 47 of those 260. 30 of our own, so 30 projects that we actually funded through the National Estuary Program. And the others are just projects that are happening like up here in Volusia, Riverside Conservancy or, Marine Discovery Center, the projects they're doing. So we are making progress. But I'm getting kind of old in the tooth. We were talking earlier, and I don't make it a secret, I'm fighting cancer. So I don't have a long time to wait for this stuff. So I'm really, and plus I grew up in New York, I'm really impatient. And so we have really good evidence now that to do this right in all 6 counties with the infrastructure, we're looking at about a $5 billion lift. It's going to take $5 billion to do the work. And everybody goes, well, how do we fund that? And the answer is you're going to fund it little by little based on what you can do and what you want to do within every single little city, within every county, every state agency in the federal government. And Brevard County is, one of the best examples in the nation of a county that made a decision back in 2016. They looked at how they might raise money as a county and decided that sales tax is the best way to do it. Partly because tourists are paying about 30% of that. And so right now, that passed with 63% of the vote. It's a half-cent sales tax over 10 years. They expected to raise about $30 million a year, so $300 million over 10, dedicated just to the lagoon. Those dollars can't be used anywhere else. They can't be stolen from one place and put to another. There's a project list, that was already identified when the public voted, for that half-cent sales tax.